The late summer of AD 83 draped the northern reaches of Britain in its familiar shroud of mist and chill, as though the land itself wished to hide from the coming storm. Across the rugged highlands of Caledonia, where mountains clashed with the sky and forests swallowed the light, a Roman army advanced with the slow, deliberate confidence of an empire that believed the world itself would eventually bend before its will. At its head marched Gnaeus Julius Agricola, Rome's governor in Britain, a man as disciplined and relentless as the legions he commanded. Agricola had already spent 7 years carving his way through the British Isles, pushing farther north than any Roman general before him. He had marched through rebellion, crushed tribes, built forts on lands no Roman had ever dared to tread. And now only one obstacle remained: the fierce, fractured, but unbroken peoples of Caledonia. They had watched Rome swallow the world piece by piece, and now they stood as the final free tribes of Britain. Word soon reached Agricola that these tribes, known collectively as the Caledonians, had formed a rare and precarious unity under a single leader. His name was Calgacus, a man whose deeds would have been lost to time had they not been recorded by Agricola's own son-in-law, the historian Tacitus. Through Tacitus's pen, Calgacus emerged as a warrior of commanding presence, an orator who stirred his people with fiery defiance, and a leader who understood that this battle would be the final line between freedom and submission. To face this coalition, Agricola assembled a striking force of 17,000 to 20,000 men, an army forged as much from the edges of Rome as from its center. The core of his soldiers were seasoned auxiliaries from Batavia and Tungria, warriors recruited from the Germanic tribes who had learned to fight in the Roman fashion and excelled at close combat. Their discipline, armor, and tactical training made them a formidable spearhead, while behind them waited the heavy infantry of the Roman legions, held in reserve to break the enemy at the decisive moment. Cavalry units guarded both flanks, their horses snorting clouds of mist into the cold Caledonian air. Across the hills rose the forces of Calgacus. Tacitus claimed they numbered 30,000 strong, though Roman numbers often swelled in the telling. Whether exaggerated or not, the sight before the Romans was undeniably intimidating. The Caledonians lined the slopes in an imposing formation, resembling an inverted bow stretched tight with tension. Their warriors wore their long hair loose, their bodies painted or tattooed in swirling patterns that seemed to move with each breath, lending them an almost otherworldly aura. Their weapons were long swords, heavy spears, and wide shields of wood and leather. They stood above the Romans, occupying the high ground, a position of stark strategic advantage. It is said that Agricola ordered his auxiliary infantry to advance first, a decision that Tacitus attributes either to calculated tactical reasoning or a desire to lure the Caledonians down from their elevated perch. Perhaps Agricola knew that forcing the enemy to abandon their hill would strip them of their greatest asset, momentum. The Roman auxiliaries marched with precision, their ranks tight, their shields glinting dully beneath the pale northern sun. As they climbed upward, the first wave of Caledonian resistance came roaring forward, not on foot, but on wheels. Chariots, ancient, rattling, yet deadly, swept across the slopes, driven by charioteers who hurled javelins and spears with all the fierce energy of men fighting for their homeland. Horses neighed and skittered, instinctively avoiding the hedge of Roman spear points aimed directly at them. This distance gave the auxiliaries the chance to counterattack. Their throwing javelins, honed for accuracy, shot upward like iron birds. When a chariot veered too close, a single Roman cast was often enough to break the formation, sending driver and rider tumbling into the grass. Realizing their efforts had not halted the Roman ascent, the charioteers retreated behind their infantry lines. The auxiliaries pressed onward, closing the last stretch of ground between themselves and the Caledonian front line. Here, at last, the two forces met in a brutal clash of steel, shields, and flesh. The Caledonians fought with passion, but the Batavian and Tungrian troops held fast with a discipline that could not easily be broken. Their short Roman swords were designed for stabbing, thriving in the tight press of bodies, and their shields interlocked into a wall that blunted the wild swings of Caledonian blades. Yet the danger was far from over. On the wings of the battlefield, Caledonian cavalry began a wide, sweeping maneuver. Their goal was clear: hit the Romans from the sides, crush their flanks, and fold their formation like parchment. But Agricola had foreseen this. His own cavalry units, held carefully on both sides, surged forward at the perfect moment. Thousands of hooves thundered across the plains as Roman and Caledonian riders collided. The Romans held the advantage: better armor, sharper weapons, and a far more cohesive tactical doctrine. Within minutes, the Caledonian cavalry faltered. Many fled, others fell. They were driven so far from the field that the Roman wings suddenly found themselves unchallenged. But even without their cavalry, the Caledonian infantry still possessed sheer numbers. Warriors from their reserve lines advanced down both slopes, aiming to envelop the Roman auxiliaries, who were already engaged in fierce combat up the hill. Exhausted, but not yet broken, the Roman infantry braced themselves against what could easily have become a fatal encirclement. Agricola, however, was always several moves ahead. He had kept part of his pursuing cavalry in reserve, waiting for precisely this moment. As soon as the Caledonian reserves reached striking distance, Agricola signaled the hidden Roman cavalry to charge. They swept into the advancing tribal warriors with a devastating, thunderous impact. Panic tore through the Caledonian ranks. Warriors stumbled, shields were dropped, and the once steady formation splintered into chaos. The auxiliaries seized the moment, pushing forward with renewed momentum. Caledonian resistance began to crumble, the battle turning from a struggle to a slaughter. What happened next would become the decisive heart of the Battle of Mons Graupius. The clash on the hillside grew into a storm of iron and desperate cries. As the Roman cavalry smashed into the Caledonian reserves, the very shape of the battlefield twisted in Rome's favor, like a great tide reversing under a hidden moon. Caledonian warriors who moments before had advanced with confidence now found themselves thrown into disarray, caught between the disciplined thrust of the auxiliaries and the crushing weight of the cavalry. The hill that had seemed their shield now became a trap, hemming them in while panic seeped into their ranks. Calgacus, watching from the higher slopes, must have felt the shifting momentum long before the rout began. He had rallied his people with promises of freedom and survival, invoking the fierce spirit of the tribes. But even the fiercest spirit could falter against the cold precision of Roman steel. Below him, auxiliaries fought with grim efficiency, their short gladii plunging again and again into the gaps between shields. The Batavians, renowned for their strength and discipline, advanced like a moving wall, pushing the enemy back step by step. The Tungrians, equally relentless, carved a path through the chaos with their compact formations, each man trained to fight as part of a single deadly organism. Still, the Caledonians refused to retreat. For many, this was their homeland beneath their feet, the soil of their ancestors, and the wind that swept across the hill was the same wind that had carried the voices of their forefathers. They fought not merely to win a battle, but to prevent the erasure of their way of life. their spears thrust forward with desperate strength, their swords swung in broad arcs meant to break through Roman shields, and their war cries tore through the air like the voices of the hills themselves. For a moment, the line held, and for a moment, it seemed that Calgacus's warriors might yet turn the tide through sheer force of will. But the Romans were not so easily shaken. Agricola had been saving the final piece of his plan, a reserve of legionaries who had not yet set foot in the fray. Their armor gleamed beneath the dim sunlight, untouched by battle, their formation perfect. When Agricola gave the signal, the legions advanced as though awakened from slumber. Their long strides closed the gap with terrifying speed, and the sight of fresh Roman heavy infantry descending upon an already faltering enemy shattered whatever hope the Caledonians had left. The pressure on the center intensified as the legions joined the fight. The Caledonians, already reeling from the cavalry strike, were now hammered by an unstoppable wave of heavy shields and disciplined spear points. Many fell where they stood, refusing to yield even as the Roman advance crushed them. Others attempted to break away, seeking refuge in the woods or among the scattered rocks. But Roman cavalry hunted them relentlessly. The hill became a maze of fleeing figures, pursued by armored riders whose swords rose and fell in merciless rhythm. Tacitus would later claim that 10,000 Caledonians were slain that day. Whether the number was accurate or embellished to amplify Roman glory, the field was undeniably strewn with the bodies of those who had fought to the very end. Men collapsed atop their fallen brothers, some still clutching their weapons even in death. Others, badly wounded, dragged themselves toward the forest to escape, leaving streaks of blood in the grass. A few, seeing no chance of survival and refusing to be taken alive, raised their blades to their own throats or threw themselves upon Roman swords, choosing death on their own terms. Amid the chaos, Calgacus himself vanished into the mist of legend. Tacitus does not tell us whether he fell in battle, escaped into the woods, or lived to fight another day. He simply disappears, like a ghost dissolving into the fog that forever blankets the highlands. But his spirit lived on in the stories of the tribes, stories of a leader who stood against the empire at its peak, a man whose voice echoed through the hills long after the battle's end. As the Caledonian lines broke, Agricola pressed the advantage relentlessly. He knew that a routed enemy could become dangerous again if allowed time to regroup. Roman cavalry swept along the edges of the forest, cutting down stragglers and preventing any attempt at reformation. Auxiliaries tightened their ranks and pushed forward with relentless rhythm, clearing the field of resistance. The legions advanced behind them, their movements calm, almost ritualistic, as though they were not fighting, but performing a duty that had been drilled into them 1,000 times. Nightfall finally brought an end to the slaughter. The sky above the battlefield darkened into a heavy canopy of clouds, and the sounds of fighting dwindled into scattered screams and the faint clatter of armor. Roman trumpets signaled the halt, their deep notes echoing off the hills like the closing of a chapter. Both armies, one victorious, the other shattered, pulled back into the shadows of night. The Romans established their camps with practiced speed, erecting palisades and lighting torches that bathed the hillside in a flickering orange glow. Soldiers tended to their wounded, cleaned their weapons, and whispered among themselves about the scale of the victory. Some spoke proudly of the day's achievements. Others stared silently into the flames, aware of how close they had come to death on that unforgiving slope. Across the darkness, in the thick woods where the last remnants of the Caledonians had fled, the atmosphere was far different. The survivors moved like shadows between the trees, their breath ragged, their bodies bruised and cut. Mothers searched for sons, warriors for comrades, leaders for any sign that the tribes could muster resistance again. But hope was fragile. The woods that once seemed like a sanctuary now felt like a graveyard for a dying dream. Agricola's scouts ventured toward the forest the next morning, but found no organized force, only scattered bodies and the silent watch of the trees. Whatever Caledonian strength remained had melted into the wilderness like morning fog. The Battle of Mons Graupius was over, and its consequences would echo through the centuries. Yet the story was far from finished, for victory on the battlefield did not mean the land was conquered, nor that its people's spirit had been extinguished. Rome had won the day, but Caledonia would remain a thorn in its side for generations. Dawn came slowly to the blood-soaked hills, its pale light creeping over the battlefield, as though hesitant to illuminate the horrors of the night before. The mist drifted low and silent, curling around the bodies scattered across the grass. Roman soldiers moved among them with grim purpose, gathering weapons, counting the fallen, and ensuring that no wounded enemy could rise again with a final burst of desperate rage. The smell of iron and damp earth clung to the air, a reminder that victory always carried a bitter scent. Agricola himself stood at the crest of the hill, surveying the remnants of the battle with a gaze both sharp and contemplative. Though he had secured a victory more decisive than any Roman general before him in the far north, he understood that triumph in Caledonia was never absolute. The tribes were like the land itself, hard, stubborn, unyielding. One battle could break their armies, but not their spirit. And Agricola, with years of command behind him, knew that the true challenge would come not from the warriors slain yesterday, but from those who slipped silently into the forests, vowing revenge. Yet in Rome's eyes, the victory at Mons Graupius was a jewel worthy of celebration. Here, on the edge of the known world, Agricola had defeated a coalition that might have challenged Rome's hold on Britain. He had demonstrated the superiority of Roman training, discipline, and leadership, and he had done so with calculated precision. Tacitus would later memorialize this triumph in his writings, giving Agricola a place in history that even emperors could not diminish. But on the ground, the victory felt less like glory and more like exhaustion. Soldiers tended to their comrades, cutting strips of cloth for bandages, boiling water over hastily built fires, and murmuring prayers to the gods for those who would not survive their wounds. Some auxiliaries wandered the field in search of fallen friends, their steps heavy as they flipped bodies only to find unfamiliar faces staring blankly at the sky. The trauma of battle lingered in their eyes, a mix of relief and sorrow born from having lived through yet another day of slaughter. Beyond the Roman camp, the forest remained eerily quiet. Scouts returned with little to report. No ambushes, no regrouping forces, no sign that Calgacus or any other leader planned to renew the fight. It was as if the woods themselves had swallowed the survivors whole. Some whispered that the Caledonian spirits had retreated deeper into the wilderness to gather their strength, that they would return like wolves at the scent of weakness. Others believed the tribes had been broken beyond repair, destined to fade into scattered clans, too small and too weary to mount a new resistance. Agricola refused to indulge in either fantasy. He ordered his men to remain alert and established patrols along the forest's edge, knowing well that an enemy beaten was not an enemy gone. If the Caledonians were watching, he intended to show them that Rome did not tire after victory. Rome dug in, fortified, and prepared for whatever came next. Yet even as the Romans worked, the land seemed to resist their presence. The highlands stretched out like a great stone beast, its slopes steep and uninviting, its winds cold enough to pierce through armor. The very terrain defied Roman logic. Too wild for roads, too uneven for formations, too vast for easy subjugation. And though Agricola had proven that Rome's armies could triumph over the tribes, he knew that holding this land would require more than a single battle. As the day wore on, Roman engineers began constructing a temporary fort on the hill, hammering stakes into the ground and raising wooden walls with practiced efficiency. They worked with the understanding that their presence here was both a symbol and a warning. Caledonia was not yet conquered, but Rome had claimed this victory, and it intended to make that claim visible. Torches flickered along the perimeter as soldiers took up their posts, forming a ring of vigilance around the camp. Inside the fort's growing walls, Agricola gathered his officers. Maps were spread across a wooden table, weighted down with stones to keep the wind from carrying them away. The men spoke in low voices about the condition of the army, the political implications of the victory, and the uncertain future of their campaign. Some urged Agricola to pursue the retreating tribes into the depths of the highlands, to crush whatever resistance remained before it could take root again. Others advised caution, warning that further advance might stretch their supply lines too thin or led them into unfamiliar traps. Agricola listened to each argument, weighing the risks with the instincts of a seasoned commander. He knew that decisive action could bring lasting peace, but he also understood the limitations of his force and the dangers of pushing too far into a land that offered more hostility than reward. There were no cities here to capture, no fertile plains to claim, only hills, forests, and fierce warriors who would rather die than submit. Across the highlands, Caledonian survivors gathered in small groups, hidden beneath the canopy of ancient trees. They tended their wounds in silence, the crackle of distant Roman fires echoing faintly through the night. Men who had never known fear now found themselves shaken, mourning comrades and leaders who had fallen. Though the Roman victory had been overwhelming, the embers of defiance still glowed. Some whispered that Calgacus still lived, that he would return to rally them again. Others spoke of withdrawing deeper into the mountains, to lands where no Roman had set foot, where they could rebuild in the shadows. But the tribes understood that something irreversible had happened on that hillside. They had stood united for the first time in living memory, and it had not been enough. Now they would need new strategies, new alliances, or perhaps a new way of resisting altogether. For as long as Rome remained in Britain, the Caledonians would not know peace. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the land. In the Roman camp, torches were lit once more, marking the beginning of another night on the edge of empire. Agricola stood outside his tent, staring into the darkening forest, aware that the story of Caledonia was far from finished. He had won a monumental victory, but he knew the tribes were watching, waiting, planning. Somewhere beyond those trees, the wild heart of Caledonia still beat, and Rome, for all its power, had not yet learned how to silence it. Night settled over the highlands, with a deep, almost suffocating silence. Inside the Roman fort, the crackling of campfires and the low murmur of exhausted soldiers created a fragile bubble of warmth against the cold Caledonian air. Beyond the walls, however, the darkness felt alive. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a distant branch seemed to carry the presence of unseen eyes. The Romans had won the battle, but the land itself was far from conquered. Agricola found little rest that night. Though he had spent a lifetime leading men, The weight of this victory pressed heavily on him. Battles were simple, harsh, bloody, but predictable. What came after was far more uncertain. Rome expected results. The emperor expected progress. Yet here at the world's edge, progress felt like a fragile illusion, easily shattered by the simplest misstep. Still, Agricola understood that momentum was everything. If the tribes believed Rome would hesitate, they would return like wolves sensing weakness. So before dawn's first light brushed the sky, he ordered his officers to prepare the army to move. The men packed their gear with quiet efficiency, the lingering fatigue of battle settling into their bones. They formed ranks just as the sun began to rise, its faint glow pushing back the night's shadows. The fort, hastily built but sturdy, stood as a reminder of their presence, a marker carved into the land to show that Rome had come, fought, and prevailed. But Agricola did not intend to linger on this hill. Victory meant nothing if it did not lead to stability, and stability would not come from resting on the ruins of battle. The army marched northward, deeper into the wild heart of Caledonia. The terrain grew harsher with every mile. Jagged rocks jutted out from the earth like the bones of ancient beasts, and dense forests seemed to press inward as though trying to swallow the invaders whole. Rain came and went in sudden bursts, driven sideways by the wind, soaking the soldiers to the skin and turning the ground beneath their feet to mud. Yet the Romans marched on, their discipline carrying them where comfort could not. Scouts moved ahead, slipping silently through the trees. Their reports were always the same. No large gatherings of warriors, no fresh fortifications, no sign that the Caledonians were preparing a counterattack. Instead, the tribes had scattered into the mountains like shadows, disappearing into terrain they knew better than any map could ever hope to capture. It was as if the land itself had granted them sanctuary. But the absence of enemies unsettled the Roman ranks far more than direct confrontation ever could. Soldiers whispered that the tribes were watching them from the treetops or tracking them from behind rocks, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The wind seemed to carry voices that were not there, the distant echoes of the warriors they had fought only days before. Every sound became a threat. Every shadow seemed to hide an ambush. Agricola sensed this unease, and though he did not fear the Caledonians returning in force, he feared what creeping doubt could do to disciplined men. So he ordered the construction of a chain of forts across the territory, each positioned to support the next. These outposts would act as a spine stretching into the highlands, a permanent Roman presence that would break the land into manageable pieces. Engineers worked tirelessly, cutting timber, raising walls, and digging ditches, while soldiers stood guard with eyes fixed on the surrounding wilderness. Days passed, each one blending into the next. The Romans continued their march, carving roads through the woods, clearing paths across rocky slopes, and planting the seeds of Roman order in a land that resisted it at every turn. Though the Caledonians remained hidden, signs of their presence lingered everywhere. Abandoned huts, footprints in the mud, a recently extinguished fire beneath a stone overhang, clues that the tribes were near, unseen yet always present. One evening, just as the light began to fade, a Roman patrol returned with a prisoner. He was a Caledonian warrior, captured after attempting to scout the camp. His hair was wild, his body painted with blue spirals that glowed faintly in the firelight. He stood tall despite his shackles, meeting Agricola's gaze with a mixture of defiance and resignation. The governor questioned him, but the warrior offered only silence. It was not fear that held his tongue, but pride. He had survived Mons Graupius, and though defeated, he would not give Rome the satisfaction of hearing his voice tremble. Agricola dismissed the man, ordering that he be treated humanely. Rome had many tools at its disposal: violence, intimidation, diplomacy, and Agricola preferred to use them with precision rather than cruelty. But as he returned to his tent, one thought haunted him. The tribes had not given up. They were merely waiting. The deeper the Romans pushed into Caledonia, the more the land turned against them. Narrow passes forced them into single-file marches, vulnerable to ambush. Sudden storms washed away their progress, and thick fog reduced visibility to almost nothing. Supplies grew thin, and foraging became increasingly difficult in the unforgiving terrain. 3 men disappeared during a scouting mission, and though the forest revealed no trace of them, everyone knew their fate. Whispers of unseen hunters spread through the ranks, growing like poison. Agricola realized that he stood at a crossroads. Pressing too far risked losing control of his army to exhaustion and fear, but withdrawing without securing dominance would invite rebellion the moment his back was turned. Caledonia was not a land that could be conquered by strength alone. It required patience, vigilance, and an understanding that some victories were not won through battle, but through endurance. One night, as the army camped in a sheltered valley, Agricola stood outside his tent, staring up at the stars that flickered faintly through the shifting clouds. He thought of the frozen silence in the hills, of the tribes scattered but unbroken, and of Rome, so distant yet omnipresent in the expectations that weighed upon him. Behind him, the campfires glowed like islands of light in an endless sea of darkness. Before him stretched a land that would never surrender, not fully, not truly. He knew then that Mons Graupius had not been the end of the conflict, but merely its beginning. The valley remained restless through the night, as if the very earth beneath the Roman camp refused to sleep. Winds swept down from the northern peaks, carrying with them the distant cries of birds and the eerie whistles that echoed through deep ravines. Though the fires burned brightly, casting warm circles of light, the darkness beyond those circles felt impenetrable. The Caledonian wilderness, vast and untamed, seemed to breathe with a life of its own, a life that cared nothing for the ambitions of Rome. Agricola awoke before dawn, the cold air biting at his skin. He stepped from his tent and surveyed the faint outline of the distant hills. They rose like immense shadowed teeth against the horizon, their ridges softened by drifting fog. It was a hauntingly beautiful land, yet one filled with quiet defiance. Each tree seemed an ancient sentinel watching his army's every move, and each gust of wind whispered warnings in a tongue far older than Latin. His officers assembled shortly afterward, their cloaks wrapped tightly around their shoulders, faces still etched with fatigue. The night had offered little rest for any of them. As they gathered around a map spread across a wooden table, Agricola understood what his men did not dare say aloud. They had reached the limits of what could be achieved through force alone. Pushing farther into Caledonia would yield no decisive victory, only a slow, grinding attrition that would drain morale and fracture discipline.